year 1944. The free men of the world are marching together to victory.
About 195 days of combat. About 2022. Always jump number one.
Out at sea in the dark, the greatest armada the world has ever seen was steaming closer to the enemy shore. Around 5,000 Allied vessels were due to begin the assault at 6:30 a.m. With the British Airborne landing around the eastern flank of the invasion area, the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were also landing on the western side and having similar problems with the drop zones, with the weather and the German flak as they landed in the dark of night behind Omaha and Utah beaches. Some of the troops came in by glider. After release from the towing C-47, the job of landing the flimsy glider was made even more difficult by fields of mine-tipped poles, Rommel's asparagus, and any mistake sent the glider and its men cartwheeling into destruction.
They told us two things. One, whatever you do, don't come back with the plane unwounded. So that's a court-martial offense, desertion in the face of the enemy, and our firing squad won't miss.
The Screaming Eagle seemed snake-bit from the start. No sooner had the first wave of 9 C-47s passed over the French coast than they were enveloped by heavy cloud. The lead group of 3 planes held course, but the 2 following groups veered off in opposite directions as the pilots tried to avoid mid-air collisions. The formation disintegrated completely.
The guys flying those planes were rookies like us, okay? We'd never been in combat. They had never been in combat. And where they were supposed to take you didn't happen to too many of them. They started spreading out, didn't hold their formation. They dropped you here or there. It didn't slow down like they're supposed to. And guys came out, shooting snapped so hard, gun in a holder was bust off of their side.
They're often lambasted for the misdrops that happened on D-Day. You actually look into the reasons why the misdrops occurred and actually begin to look at them from a pilot's perspective as opposed to the airborne soldiers on board, then a lot of what happened that night can be explained.
And I'm looking out of the door, looking ahead, and I could see fires burning on the ground, and I yelled to the troops, "We're in great shape. The Air Corps has bombed hell out of things. The houses burning up ahead of us." I didn't realize till the next day that those weren't houses. They were planes from the serial ahead of us. All of a sudden, that was the emptiest cabin I ever saw in my life. Even the crew chief was gone. You crouch, and you put both hands outside the thing, and you kick out with your right leg. I did have a battle cry when I jumped in Normandy. It was, oh shit.
They were tasked to take the ground, stop the Germans from flooding the area, keep the causeways over the marshy area open, and deny German reinforcements access to the beaches, so that the 29th and the Big Red 1 infantry groups could land on the beach and not be bottled up in a killing zone. The confused landings and subsequent fighting became the stuff of legend.
And I heard some Germans coming down the street. I thought, oh Christ, I've had it. And I turned around and there's nobody there.
They had to deal with hedgerows, unknown country, and drainage ditches like this. Some of these proved deadly, especially at night when you didn't know where they were going. Veteran 101st paratrooper Tom Rice jumped into the Content Peninsula Normandy on D-Day, as Tom had boarded the plane in England on the night of June the 5th, 1944. He was not sure if he and his 12-man stick really knew what was waiting for them on the other side. He thought that if the men had known, it would not have made any difference. Like many young men in America at this time, he had grown up through the Depression era. Tough times that produced tough people.
Are you nervous at all?
Oh no, they're not shooting at us this time. That makes it much safer. I kind of know what's going to happen. I hope it happens that way.
Training at Fort Benning was rigorous, both physically and mentally. The art of parachuting troops from aircraft into conflict was still evolving. Lessons learned by the regiment in North Africa and Sicily were hurriedly put into practice, and the airborne troops became the tip of the spear that thrust into occupied Europe.
Well, I honor those who didn't come back, who were wounded, who walked away from it, who are deceased. Those are the guys who are the heroes. I'm a risk taker, about 2022, about 195 days of combat, 2 combat jumps, 4 wounds. I came from a city that was all Navy, Coronado, California. I always jumped number 1, and I stepped out and got hit with a prop blast, and my armpit got caught in the lower left-hand corner of the door. So I swung out, came back and hit the side of the airplane, swung out, came back, and I turned just enough to get my arm loose. I had a brand new wristwatch I bought, $285. It got stripped off. Probably some good Frenchman got it. The jump altitude was 750, but I jumped maybe 500. So I was in the ground a couple oscillations, and that was it. I didn't get hurt because I had so much equipment on me. I weighed 276 pounds. My normal weight was 137. Saint-Mere-Eglise. Stayed in the Normandy area for 37 days.
Sergeant Tom Rice and others in the airborne divisions fought in scattered groups, often not seeing their attackers, gradually joining up with comrades over several days. Some did not even know if the invasion had been successful. The meandering Meredith and Douvre rivers had ancient lock systems to keep out the sea. One of the most frightening features were the hedgerows of the bocage. These places were a death trap for the Allied troops. It became known as the Green Hell. Many times you'd break through straight into a pre-sighted killing zone.
We got to the point where they're picking up more and more men, and every one of them would ask, what's your plan?
Much of the American paratroop action centered on the town of Saint-Mere-Eglise, which has become the spiritual home of the airborne divisions. Many of the 82nd Airborne, who had been based at Corn in England, fought their way into Saint-Mere-Eglise. 220 of them died in the area, and many more were wounded in the battle, as the town was taken, lost and retaken several times. Some of the unfortunate paratroopers got hung up on these trees here, and they were machine gunned as they swung to and fro in their parachutes. And these trees are preserved as a memorial to those men who fought and died in the early hours of June the 6th, 1944. The men of the 82nd and the 101st had a hell of a battle, both from in the centre of town and from those outside, converging on their objective. The street fighting was intense, with paratroopers jumping in and out of doorways as they worked their way to the centre of town. Some of the town still bears the marks today, but after a few hours, Saint-Mere-Eglise was in American hands. It was the first small town to be liberated in France. As Allied airborne troops began to take their objectives on both flanks, 5 miles out to sea, the battleships opened fire on German defences, and Allied bombers pounded the 60 miles of coastline. And the invasion fleet approached the beaches. The invasion came literally out of the blue, filling the sea and the air with an overwhelming force of impending doom for the German defenders. But the 5,000 vessels of the approaching fleet and its anxious men were facing a formidable array of obstacles as they got closer to the beaches in the early morning gloom. There was a daunting array of thick bomb-proof bunkers, many of the big guns pointed out to sea to take out enemy vessels. Others were sighted along the beaches to shell the enemy from the sides if and when they landed. These guns at Saint-Mere caused many casualties on British and American beaches. But the naval guns out in the Channel, once they were accurately zeroed in, started to wreak havoc with these installations. It must have been hell inside here. When the landing craft ramp dropped, the first wave of troops were pre-sighted sitting ducks. The landings on the 3 beaches in the British and Canadian sector went better than expected. The experimental armour of Percy Hobart's funnies and the DD tanks helped the Allies here break through the hard crust of the beach defences. The overall number of men killed on Sword, Juno and Gold in the 24 hours of D-Day was almost 2,000. Sighted close to Omaha Beach, Point du Hoc had been identified as a high-priority stronghold by American top brass. The big guns there had to be neutralised if Omaha and Utah beaches were to be taken. The US Rangers, who courageously climbed the steep cliffs and assaulted the positions, were disappointed to find that the guns had been removed half a mile inland for maintenance. Nevertheless, they had achieved their audacious mission. Or had they? Colonel Rudder has a monument to the Rangers and himself here. He has since been lauded as the model Ranger soldier. It was a fantastic military feat, but something wasn't quite right about what happened just after.
I think what has crept into the D-Day story and the Normandy story is a lot of distortions because of its familiarity. And the same thing gets repeated over and over and over again. Suddenly assumed knowledge becomes the truth, when in fact actually it's not the truth at all.
Just westward of this well-known monument has emerged a place that was built in total secrecy. So Dan and Gary Stern have literally uncovered something of great importance. Something that affects the story of D-Day. It played a dangerous part in the Allied landings, shelling both Utah and Omaha beaches. But it has only recently been discovered, and the full extent of its importance is still being revealed. Because sometime after the main Allied forces had pushed inland, the battery was bulldozed over by the army, buried and forgotten. This is the battery at Grandcamp-Maisy.
And the Germans do everything in such a specific manner. Through my dad's research and my dad's logic really, he established that there had to be a missing position in between Point du Hoc and the Carentan estuary. And he discovered in a guy's kit he bought in Louisville, Kentucky, and in the pocket was a big bundle of maps. One of the maps had this stretch of coast marked on it, and on it was a cross-hatched area with area of high resistance. Rummaging through the bushes, and they discovered they were stood on a platform of concrete. Now their initial thought was that it was the floor of a building, and it was only when my dad tripped over a chimney that he thought, aha, we're stood on the roof here, we're not on the floor.
This is just one of the many bunkers that have been discovered. In all, there were 16 heavy guns located here with flak batteries and around 200 men. And attached to this is a very, very controversial story and an amazing cover-up. This bunker was meant to be taken by the Rangers on June the 6th. As they scaled Point du Hoc, dealt with the guns there, they were then to come straight over here to the bunker. Their commanding officer didn't give the order until 3 days later. The implications for Omaha were tremendous, because the guns from this battery kept firing and firing for another 3 days. We will return to this story in more detail in a later episode. The Americans on Utah Beach used their armour well. The beach was taken with relatively light casualties. Landing craft came up onto the beach and began discharging their cargoes so that they could pump men and machines and materiel inland to expand the bridgehead and meet up with the paratroopers. But they were still being shelled by Grandcamp-Maisy for 3 long days.
I landed here at Utah Beach, attached to the 4th Division, the 4-leaf clover, then 23. So there was some woods there, and they said that they figured there's about 300 Germans in the woods, so they put some of the guys on the tanks. I don't know what we're supposed to do with 300 of them. We were back of the church in Saint-Mere-Eglise. The 82nd Airborne had dug in, and when they left, then we took it over for that one night.
Inland from Utah Beach stands the still intimidating Crispec bunker. These 210mm guns could destroy Allied shipping at a range of 12 miles and pound the beaches at Omaha and Utah. Despite having over 1,000 Allied bombs strike the battery over 2 months, the guns were still operating and firing on D-Day. There were still heavy losses, but the weight of numbers propelled the Allied forces forward. Between the Americans and the British sections on the eastern side of the Vera estuary was Omaha Beach. 75 years ago there were no trees, there was no cover, it was all mown down to give clear fields of fire. Seen from the air, its crescent shape, edged by rising bluffs, makes it easy to see how the Germans had made good use of this natural defensive position. This was an open killing ground. The men of the Big Red 1 and the 29th Infantry Divisions growling through the choppy seas in their small landing craft were wet, cold and seasick. They watched in awe as their air force streamed overhead, dropping hundreds of tons of high explosives onto the enemy positions. What they didn't know was that the bombs had fallen too far inland, and by and large missed many German positions. Also, the craters they were supposed to make in the beach to provide additional cover were made instead in empty fields inland. When the small craft of the first wave got closer to the beach, the big guns zeroed in on them and blew several out of the water. The carnage was just beginning.
Everywhere you looked, as far as you could see, floating in the water were bodies. That's the first time I had ever seen anything like that, and I didn't want to see anything like that. But that's how it was. When they opened that gate, we knew that was war, and that was it. I mean, that's what you were going to do there.
The duplex drive tanks had launched at 5,000 yards. The command Floaters 5000 saw the ungainly machines waddle down the ramps into the choppy sea.
The Omaha incident was quite a disaster because the tanks were pushed off course by the currents and the strong winds, and when they turned to go back to their beach, in fact they went side on to the waves. They didn't just go down because of the sea, they went down because they turned.
The first wave had no heavy weapons with them to tackle the formidable strongpoints. The German troops in their bunkers and on the cliff tops readied their machine guns and held their fire until the landing craft got closer and the ramps went down. Having their machine guns zeroed in onto the beach meant that they could hit the landing craft with deadly effect. Then the killing began in earnest. This was starting to become the nightmare that the Allies had tried so hard to avoid. There was nowhere to hide from the murderous machine gun fire. Morale amongst the men enduring this withering fire began to sink. Would they ever get off the beach? Would the enemy fire ever cease? There were acts of extreme heroism, often by unassuming medics, but many of the men in that first wave had faced too much, had lost equipment, lost officers, and any sense of cohesion. For the American troops who managed to make it off the landing craft and get across 200 to 300 yards of open sand, they flung themselves against the shingle bank and lay there, cold, wet, and terrified. This was the only protection they had. And it was that murderous gunfire that gave the name to this beach, Bloody Omaha. Some of the 2nd Battalion of the 16th Infantry had landed near Colville, further east, and crossed the beach with very light casualties, and began working their way around the rear of the German defences. In a bold departure from the original plan, 8 American and 3 British destroyers broke from their positions and sailed up and down, dangerously close to the shore, using their guns against the enemy's stronghold. Almost 4 hours after the initial landings and the subsequent waves, General Giraud, 10 miles offshore, received a message from Colonel Talley on the beach. Things look better. In a Dante-esque mess of burning landing craft, uncleared obstacles, dead bodies and exploding shells from batteries like Crisquet and Grandcamp-Maisy, men and machines began to work their way ashore. At 5:21 in the afternoon, Colonel Talley reported that the beach could take wheeled and tracked vehicles. Using bulldozers and tanks and blowing up obstacles, the invading forces pushed through the draws, past the heavily shelled enemy bunkers. This bunker was in the middle of one of the routes that was opened up by the Americans as they got off the beach. The Big Red One worked their way up the hill and eventually destroyed this bunker with the help of a battleship offshore. This was the beginning of success at Omaha, getting the troops up this draw. The US Army engineers took it over and made it their headquarters. All along the coastline, the plan to invade Normandy was starting to produce results. But it all came at a high cost.
They were all facing the shore, dead on the beach. And it was unbelievable. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. We landed on shore and went up on shore just like nothing was going on, you know, because everybody was dead already. The damage had already been done when we got there. That's the beginning of my war.
In all, over 1,400 American lives were lost in the first 24 hours on and around the beach, which soon became known as Bloody Omaha. Thousands more were wounded. At the end of June the 6th, all of the Allied beaches along the 60 miles of coastline had been taken and were relatively secure. They had not made the gains they initially wanted, but the loss of life was not as high as it had been predicted, and the build-up of forces over the beaches was starting to bring in the necessary numbers.
I think there is this sort of urgency because the veterans are slipping away, but there is this sort of renewed interest.
On the 75th anniversary of D-Day, there were many ceremonies. and as many veterans of the campaign who could make it. Supported by friends and family, they came, perhaps for the last time, to lay flowers, pay respects to fallen comrades, and remember this titanic battle.
And remember, we have that freedom to stand here today because of their efforts. No mission too difficult, no sacrifice too great, duty first, victory.
The cemetery at Omaha holds only a fraction of those Americans killed in the whole Normandy campaign. Many bodies were returned home to their families in the States. Others died of wounds after being shipped back to England and remain in the American cemetery near Cambridge. George Tullidge, 82nd Airborne, James Bordereau, on the USS Corrie. Sidney Dunnigan, 9th Air Force, troop carrier. William Benn, 1st Infantry, from Pennsylvania, killed June the 6th, 1944. The British and Commonwealth soldiers tended to be buried in smaller cemeteries, close to the battlefield where they fell. This is one of the smaller roadside cemeteries. The Coldstream Guards, buried here side by side as they would have marched. The scale of the losses is overpowering, and the thousands of small stories become almost too much to bear. But people still come here.
You know, I look back to what I was like as a 20-year-old, and what a feckless, useless individual I was. Gosh, you know, had that been 1944, I might have been commanding a company or a squadron of Spitfires.
The German losses on D-Day were staggering. The graveyard close to the coast is a sombre, Teutonic affair. As with any graveyard, it's a very sobering, sombre experience. But this one always strikes me as being different. There's just a sense of futility. All these soldiers died, and still, their cause was lost. Here there are no great worthy proclamations, honour, truth, democracy, freedom. Nothing like that. The interest in D-Day and Normandy, shown by so many people from many different walks of life, is indicative of the realization that without this sacrifice and endeavour, shown by ordinary people doing extraordinary things, our lives would not have the freedoms we take for granted in our modern world.
A bitter, difficult battle,
à coup sûr sanglant.
Which would certainly claim the lives of many.
Ces milliers de soldats donc.
Tens of thousands of soldiers, drafted or volunteers,
avaient pour la plupart.
Most were barely 20 years old.
The full violence of Nazi fury was no match for the full grandeur of British pride. Thank you.
75 years ago, hundreds of thousands of young soldiers, sailors and airmen left these shores in the cause of freedom. What is demanded from us all is something more than courage. That is exactly what those brave men brought to the battle, as the fate of the world depended on their success.
On these shores, on these bluffs, on this day 75 years ago, 10,000 men shed their blood and thousands sacrificed their lives for their brothers, for their countries, and for the survival of liberty.
I'm Sergeant Winneal. I'm with the 4th Infantry Division out of Fort Carson, Colorado. Today we did the march from Utah Beach to Saint-Domingue. It was legitimately incredible. I got to stand and walk behind someone carrying an M1 and carrying the gear and wearing the uniform. I tried to put myself in the shoes of the people that came before me, and it was incredible. The reenactors were awesome, mostly French nationals, a couple Americans, a couple Czech guys. People are coming from all over the place.
Doing it is sort of in honour of the members of the Filthy 13, who were the demolition team for 506.
A lot of people are coming from all over the world. They're coming with Dutch, with jeeps, to be honest, also the Germans did participate during the war here. And today we are friends. We have the same hobby. We like all vehicles. We have the same problems.
It's almost a modern-day pilgrimage, with a mixture of many emotions for everyone. Respect, thankfulness, sorrow, reflection, a kind of healing, and thanks.
We're here to honor 29th Infantry Division landing here 75 years ago on D-Day.
The 75th anniversary brought forth a whole host of people who wanted to commemorate, honour, and above all celebrate what previous generations had done for their freedom.
I've always had an interest in America as a country, so that's kind of where my interest went that side.
Ordinary people, not just politicians, who wanted to connect with what other ordinary people of another time had done.
For me, it's the vehicles mainly, but
mostly to be able to bring back one that's got a real history to it and keep it alive. That's the important thing. They didn't fly D-Day. This did.
After we finish after D-Day, we're driving all the way to Bastogne, Belgium.
You read them, and then when you're doing the actions at the same time, it really connects to you and as interpreters.
Incredible atmosphere in Normandy, having a party of this sense of freedom and liberty. You know, anyone could go anywhere they wanted, they could do whatever they liked, they could drink, they could shout from the rooftops. That freedom was so hard fought for back in 1944. And it's really important that we don't forget that when this greatest generation does finally slip away.
We caught up with Jim Clark, just outside Saint-Mere-Eglise, who'd made it to Normandy in his GMC.
We've got something called First Infantry Stew tonight. Tinned vegetables, taters, heat it up. Beautiful.
And it is possible to see a lot of this arsenal, you know, of Sherman tanks, of guns, of trucks and jeeps. You know, people lovingly restore this stuff, and you can see them motoring around the streets of Normandy at the moment. And I suppose the more visible it is, the more it's going to reach more people, and the more people are going to have their interest sparked by this.
The numbers of veterans are dwindling now, health deteriorating, but not the spirit. For many, it will be their last call to Normandy. It's a somber reflection that the artifacts of war will soon outlast the human participants. As we prepare to leave it now, the Battle of Normandy will officially last another 80 days.
The tanks had already gone out and they were moving out before us, you know.
The Battle of the Beaches is won, and the bridgehead in Europe established, but the journey to liberation and freedom still has a long way to go.
They picked him up, still in his chute, and poured him from the boot. He ain't gonna jump no more.